Hello and welcome to this Deakin University alumni webinar with presenter Associate Professor Patrick Stokes. Sam Johnston here from the Deakin Alumni Relations team. It's great to have you with us. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which we're broadcasting today, the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Today we're broadcasting from Deakin's downtown offices, and our webinar topic is Living with the Digital Dead. To watch past webinar and seminar recordings, you can visit the webinar and resources page on the Deakin Alumni website, which is displayed on your screen now. So the presentation will run for about 40 minutes, followed by a discussion session with presenter Associate Professor Stokes. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box and hit submit, and then we'll get to as many as we can during the discussion time at the end. Patrick Stokes is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Deakin University, where he's worked since 2012. He previously held research positions in Denmark, the UK and US. He's written extensively on the work of 19th century philosopher Søren Kierkegaard and has also published on death, personal identity and moral philosophy. He's a prolific media commentator on philosophical matters, appearing regularly in New Philosopher, The Conversation, Radio National, and ABC Melbourne. Thank you so much for joining us today, Patrick.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate so many people taking out their lunchtime to talk about death, which is not always the first thing you want to talk about during your lunch break. But the topic that I'm going to be talking about today is one that I've been working on in one way or another since about 2011. And one thing I've found really interesting about this, and this doesn't always happen to philosophers, is that when I start talking to people about it, everyone's had some experience of it, as I myself had. One of the things that got me interested in this topic was that I was already working on philosophy of death and issues around memorialization. And I started to notice that there were at least a couple of people in my online social network, specifically in my Facebook friends list, who were dead. And I was struck by the fact that the dead persist in this way. They persist in the online space that we all increasingly spend more and more of our time in. In fact, there's some interesting work done in philosophy of technology that suggests that we really need to stop talking about the online space as a separate realm. That 90s idea of cyberspace is this separate place that you go to. That made a lot of sense when the internet was a place that we had to sit down at a desktop computer to access. Nowadays, the internet's built into our everyday movements through the world. We all are walking around with phones and we're interacting with the world in ways that seamlessly build digital communication and digital interaction into our embodied experience of the world. So there's a suggestion actually that the online-offline distinction has more or less collapsed. No one's got a good name for what we have left. Some philosophers, Luciano Floridi and others, have called it the on-life paradigm. I'm not a huge fan of that term, but I don't think we have a better one for where we are now. So the reality is we spend more and more of our lives using online communication and living online. And not surprisingly, a lot of people are therefore dead online and dying online. We don't know how many. In fact, Carl Oman and his colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute have just published a paper last week in which they're trying to work out when the dead will start to outnumber the living on platforms like Facebook. And there's a number of different scenarios based on different assumptions about how long those platforms will survive and in what form. What they don't know, and in fact what no one seems to know exactly, is how many dead people there are right now on social media. We know that it's definitely well over the tens of millions because it was at least 30 million as long ago as 2012, but we don't know exactly how many dead people there are right now in platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter and others. There has been a lot of discussion in psychology, sociology and in internet studies as a broad interdisciplinary field into what it means for us now that we have dead people online, now that part of our mourning practices take place in these electronically mediated ways. I just sent a condolence email to someone immediately before this session, actually. So, and also how we deal with these things from a policy perspective. What do we do with the things that the dead leave behind? I'll say a bit more about that later, and there's actually some interesting developments happening on that in Australia right now, which I can give you some insight into. There's been some interesting studies around things like online grieving, grief enfranchisement. Who has the right to grieve? Who has the right to post grieving messages? Who has the right to direct the way we grieve online? And there's been some interesting studies into how we interact with the profiles of the dead. Elaine Casket, who's a British-based psychologist, has some really interesting things to say on that. And in fact, her book's just come out last week called All the Ghosts in the Machine, which I'm looking forward to. I'm a little annoyed because I wanted to use a Ghost in the Machine pun for for a chapter of my book that I'm working on at the moment. So anyway, not to worry. She got there first. So philosophers, though, haven't had a great deal to say about this. There's a couple of us that have written about this. And it's interesting, actually, that philosophers haven't been more drawn to this topic, because philosophers have been working for a very, very long time, and by a very long time I mean well over 2,500 years, on issues of death and the status of the dead, and what sort of duties or ethical responsibilities we might or might not owe to the dead. There's really interesting questions around how we can have any duties to the dead, or how we might have any sort of relationship to the dead. There's a really big ongoing problem in philosophy, which we're still grappling with. It goes all the way back to Epicurus in the 3rd century BCE, which is it possible to harm the dead? And if so, in what ways and what sort of duties can we therefore have to the dead? Do we do the dead a harm when we slander them after their death, for instance? If we fail to remember them, are we doing them a harm? Equally, if we, let's say, work to get a long executed person who was innocent exonerated, are we therefore doing them a benefit by doing that? The case of Colin Campbell Ross here in Victoria is an interesting case. He was pardoned, I think, like 80 or 90 years after he was executed. You might say, well, that's not helping him because he's long dead, he doesn't exist anymore. But there are actually some interesting arguments to show that, in fact, we can benefit and harm the dead. But that raises a whole bunch of other interesting questions. How is it possible to harm or benefit the dead? What is the relationship between harms and interests? Do we frustrate the interests of the dead? And if so, is that what causes them harm? When is it the case that the dead are harmed? Are they harmed now when they don't exist? That seems problematic. Or are they harmed in the past by something we do now? That also seems problematic. And there's broader questions here about the temporal boundaries of persons. Where do persons begin and end? Where do lives begin and end? Are persons only as temporally extended, as extended across time as their biological functioning, or do they exist for a time before and for a time afterwards? There's a whole range of fascinating philosophical questions that are well ventilated and that we could well apply to some of these questions around the ongoing electronic existence of the dead. So one question is, for instance, and this is one that I've spent a bit of time working on, do we have a right to delete the dead? The dead leave all of these artifacts behind. Is it okay to simply delete all of the stuff that they leave? Or do we do them a harm by doing that? Now, one thing you might like to do here is immediately go to some of the off-the-shelf arguments that philosophers have got waiting for you on whether it's possible to harm the dead and how it's possible to harm the dead. So there's a couple of standard approaches here. One is to say that if you do something now that frustrates the interests of a person who is now dead, what you're doing is you're making it the case now that the interests they had while they were alive were in fact always going to be frustrated. So most of us have an interest in having a good reputation. So if I slander a dead person, what I'm doing is frustrating the interest that person had while they were alive in having a good reputation. Now, you might say, but that sounds like backwards causation. Aren't you saying that what I do now harms them in the past? Well, George Pitcher famously argued, no, it's only changing the past in the same sense that if a comet were to destroy the world right now, that would make it the case that Barack Obama was the second last president of the United States. It's not so much that it changes the past, it's just that it turns out that Barack Obama was always, in fact, the second last president of the United States. Just as if I slander you after your death, I make it the case that it was always the case that you were going to have your interest in a good reputation frustrated. And if I delete your Facebook profile, perhaps I'm frustrating an interest that you had while you were alive in maintaining that profile. The other way you can do it, which I won't go into too much because it's very technical, is you can talk about possible worlds. And you can say that the nearest possible world in which I delete your Facebook profile is worse for you than the world in which I don't delete your profile. And because those are atemporal statements, we get around the timing problem. Don't worry too much about that. I'm happy to go into it in question time if need be. Thing is, of course, all that assumes that we have an interest in not having our Facebook profiles or whatever other social media profiles deleted. It's not clear that everyone just automatically has that interest. We can take it as read that most people have an interest in having a good reputation, but it's far from clear that most of us care about the ongoing persistence of our social media relics after we die. So that might lead us to think that maybe there's nothing too wrong with deleting the dead. Another way we could go, and I think this does give us more of a reason to preserve the online traces of the dead, is what's called the rescue from insignificance approach. I'm taking that phrase from Jeffrey Blustein. Blustein argues that we have a duty to remember the dead because the dead had a certain sort of value. And insofar as we say that value matters while that person was alive, we should continue to remember them to say that that value matters after they're dead. Right? It's a way of saying this person mattered, their existence mattered. In the same way that we do that with people while they live, we should continue to do that after they die. Now, this, again, is quite an old idea in philosophy. Aristotle actually says this in the Eudemian Ethics, that it's a good thing to remember the dead, and it's praiseworthy to remember the dead because the dead can't pay you back for remembering them. They can't reciprocate. Kierkegaard, in his book Works of Love, says much the same thing. He says that the work of love in remembering somebody who's dead is the freest and most uncoerced and praiseworthy duty of love, because the dead can't force you to remember them. They can't sort of impose themselves on you. And equally, they can't pay you back for remembering them. So there's a line of argument here that suggests that maybe we shouldn't delete the dead because keeping them alive in social media, so to speak, is a good way of testifying to their value and preserving their significance, rescuing them from insignificance. James Stacey Taylor has taken Blustein to task here and said that that's not really a duty to the dead. All we're saying is that if somebody's matters in a certain way while they're alive, then we should remember them after they're dead because they mattered in the same sort of way. Taylor says that's just a norm of consistency, of rational consistency. It's nothing to do with a duty to the dead. It's just saying that if we rationally care about something while a person's alive, we should continue to care about it after they're dead. So there's an interesting argument there. I actually think that there's something stronger here to be said here. What I want to say, and have argued in print, and I'm trying to sort of work this up into a book-length treatment at the moment, what I want to argue is this. There is a sense in which the dead really do persist online. It's not a sense that's anywhere near as good as ordinary survival. It's not a sense in which we could look forward to a kind of life after death online. I absolutely don't want to say that. And the dead only persist in a radically diminished way. But it's not quite the same as complete annihilation either. And for that reason, I think that the traces we leave online have a certain kind of status because they actually present a degree of survival of the person. A very limited degree, but nonetheless a degree. And I think that part of that's because there's this interesting ambiguity about the dead. The dead both continue to exist as part of our life world and are also radically absent from that life world. The dead both absolutely do not exist and absolutely continue to exist with us. That's a paradoxical position, but I think it's built into the way we experience the dead. Now, again, that's a thought that in some ways comes across as almost offensive. C.S. Lewis, the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe author, writes a very slim book, which I can well recommend, called A Grief Observed, basically detailing his grief after the death of his wife. It's a very slim book. It opens with this absolute gut punch of a line, which is, "Nobody ever told me that grief feels so much like fear." It's a really, really sharply written, honest book. At one point there, he talks about this idea that people live on in memory, for instance. And he absolutely tears into this. He says, what pitiable cant to say, she will live on forever in my memory. Live, that's exactly what she won't do. You might as well think like the old Egyptians, that you can keep the dead by embalming them. Will nothing persuade us that they're gone? What's left? A corpse, a memory, and in some versions a ghost. All mockeries or horrors. 3 more ways of spelling the word dead. It was H I loved, as if I wanted to fall in love with my memory of her, an image in my own mind. It would be a sort of incest. So that's the absent aspect of the dead. But there's also an interesting way in which the dead persist to us in the ways in which they're presented through various kinds of presence, such as, for instance, photographs. The way the dead persist with us through the visual representations of their faces. That goes, of course, all the way back into portraiture, but it's particularly strong, I think, in the case of photographs. Walter Benjamin, in his famous text, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, talks about the aura of persons. Now, he doesn't mean that in the kind of metaphysical way. What he means is the sense in which you look at an artifact and it has a sense of the authenticity of the person about it. So say that you have your grandfather's watch. There's a sense of your grandfather in the fact that it was his watch, that this is the authentic watch, his real watch. And something even stronger is given in things like portrait photography. Benjamin says, it is no accident that the portrait was the focal point of early photography. The cult of remembrance of loved ones, absent or dead, offers a last refuge for the cult value of the picture. For the last time, the aura emanates from early photographs in the fleeting expression of a human face, and this is what constitutes their melancholy, incomparable beauty. Now, interestingly, Benjamin thinks that aura doesn't appear in moving pictures. So he thinks that the photograph, the portrait photograph, presents the person in their phenomenal presence, in how they really were, but the movie doesn't. You might wonder why, and I think part of the answer to that is simply that Benjamin is born too early to be completely used to the moving picture. There's a wonderful line from the science fiction author Douglas Adams, where he says something like, any technology that's in the world when you're born just seems to you to be part of the natural order of things. Any technology that's invented up until you turn about 35 is new and exciting, and maybe you could make a living in it. Anything invented after you're 35 is unnatural and against the order of things and must be destroyed. So I think there's something like that going on. Another piece of evidence for that, this is from E.M. Forster, you know, the guy that wrote all those novels that got turned into Merchant Ivory films, Remains of the Day, Howard's End, Passage to India, all that stuff. He writes in 1909 this alarmingly prescient novella called The Machine Stops, which is set in a future where everyone sits in their little rooms, little apartments, communicating with everyone else in the world through a gigantic electronic network called the machine. And it's really quite sort of, it's unnerving. And at the start of the novella, a young man called Kuno calls his mother and says, I want you to come and visit me. And she's like, why? We don't need to visit each other. We have the machine. And he says, well, I see something like you in this plate, but I do not see you. I hear something like you through this telephone, but I do not hear you. That is why I want you to come. Pay me a visit so that we can meet face to face and talk about the hopes that are in my mind. Now, what's interesting about that is Forster's, listen to how weird it sounds to us to say, I hear something like you through this telephone, but I do not hear you. When you talk to someone on the phone, you never think, oh, I'm hearing something like the person's voice. You never think, I'm hearing a mechanical reproduction electronically transmitted of the person's voice. You just hear them. You hear their voice. It's so good to hear your voice because we're used to this technology. We're embodied to this technology. The telephone is part of the way in which we are present now to other people, just as the portrait photograph was a way in which, for Benjamin, people were present to each other. What I want to suggest here is that social media and the internet is now a very big part of our face. It's a very big part of the way in which we are present in the lives of other people. And because of that, that means that the traces we leave, our social media artifacts, are one of our substantial realizers as persons. How are we as persons realized? We're realized in our bodies. We're also, in a way, realized in the minds of others. We exist in other people's minds as agents who they have to take into account. I want to suggest that we're actually also present in the physical objects that form part of our identity, like our writing, for instance, or other objects we leave behind. And I think also in social media artifacts. Just as an aside here too, social media artifacts are an example of what Alison Landsberg has called prosthetic memory. Now, that doesn't just mean the sort of objects that we use to extend our memory in the world. If you've got a notebook or an address book that you write things in, or your mobile phone, in a sense, that's part of an extended part of your memory, right? It's an object that you use to offload some of the work of your memory. You don't remember all the phone numbers that you need to remember, so you have a notebook or a phone that does that for you. It's a little extension of your memory. Prosthetic memory is slightly different. Prosthetic memory brings even people who did not experience an event into a collective memory of it. So Walter Benjamin died decades before I was born, but I know what Walter Benjamin looked like because I've got a photo of him. So I know what the moon landing looked like because I've seen all that footage that, if you like, acts as a prosthetic memory that brings those of us born after the moon landing into an experience of it. And so I want to suggest that online resources that we leave behind are one of those prosthetic memory things that helps to preserve the face and present the face of the dead person after their death. Nice quote from Ruth McManus there, who's a Scottish sociologist living in New Zealand. She says that online resources reveal the presence of the dead stored and storied in new digital media, and stitch the breach that opens up between those who knew the dead person and those who did not, between living memory and tales of ancestors. And indeed, a lot of the sociological and psychological finding is showing that people do continue to interact with the digital dead. People keep posting on the walls of Facebook users, for instance, often years after they die, and speaking in second person. I still miss you so much. I can't believe it's been 4 years since you left us. I really wish you could have been there on Sunday. It was really wonderful. All those sort of things. People keep talking to the dead through these mechanisms. Interestingly, when there's been surveys done, a surprising number of people think that the dead can somehow hear them or can somehow on the other end of that transaction. And the way in which we persist on social media also gives a strong sense of continuity. Right, so there's a strong sense that your social media profile looks much the same after you die as it did before you die. You can get it memorialized. So Facebook, for instance, will put your death, after your death, if it's notified and if the family ask for it, they can put your account into what they call a memorialized state. They can also simply delete it. And there's interesting policy questions that arise here about, well, what do we do? Who has the right to say whether it should be deleted or memorialized? Which family member gets to make that call? What do we do if they disagree? So I think we can actually reconstruct a right of non-deletion from saying something like this. Things like data or memory traces aren't the sort of things that can have rights, but people are. And if we have a duty to remember the dead, and duties create rights, and if social network system artifacts, or social network artifacts, are implicated in how we remember the dead fully by continuing to present the dead person's face, then it seems like we've got some strong moral reasons not to delete those artifacts. They're defeasible reasons. There may well sometimes be very, very good reasons to delete somebody's artifact. If, for instance, it's really distressing to living people, there might be a good reason to delete it. But we at least have defeasible reasons, that is, reasons that can be overcome, not to delete those artifacts. Part of this involves, I think, changing the way we think about these digital artifacts. Instead of thinking of them as property, we need to think of them as more analogous to human remains. This is something that I think is kind of important to understand. When you die, you leave a whole bunch of objects to somebody else. And so the property rights transfer from you to whoever you've left them to, or whoever the laws of intestacy say it should go to. But you don't inherit or don't leave your body to someone. You can leave your body to science, but it's not as if when you die, your great-grandma dies, you inherit her body and it's now your property. Rather, what you have is a kind of custodianship. You have a sort of a right and a duty to dispose of that body, but you don't really have property rights in it. Now, interestingly, when we talk about digital artifacts of the dead, it's actually really unclear who owns them. There's interesting sort of questions around copyright law and intellectual property law around this stuff, but it's not at all clear that your Facebook page, for instance, is a piece of property that you own that you can leave to somebody else. Insofar as it's also part of your digital face, the way you're presented to the world, I actually think it's better to think of it as a kind of digital remains. I'm borrowing that term from Margaret Gibson. Part of the fabric of the person. But of course, whereas bodies have to be disposed of because they get pretty gross pretty quickly, your social media artifact needn't necessarily be disposed. It's taking up a little bit of electricity, a little bit of space on a server somewhere, but not really enough to make an outrageous demand to allow it to persist by keeping it on the network. And so it may be that we are, in fact, doing a form of violence, even just a very little one, to the dead by deleting them. So this means we need to frame some policy responses. Now, interestingly, the New South Wales Law Reform Commission has an inquiry going at the moment into the disposal of assets, digital assets of the dead and incapacitated. I've made a couple of submissions to that inquiry, and in fact, I've been to one of their meetings, and I'm going up to another one of their meetings next month. They're really grappling with this question of what do we do here? How do we dispose of these assets? Who has the right to say how they get disposed of? What uses can we legitimately make of the things that the dead leave behind? One thing I've suggested is that there should be a default presumption against deletion actually built into law. So there will be no doubt be cases where, for instance, courts are called upon to decide whether an account should be deleted or preserved. In those cases, I think there should be a default presumption against deletion unless there is a strong reason to go ahead and delete it. We also need to work out who gets to make that call. Who is your digital next of kin? Who has those rights of decisions over disposal or memorialization? And I've also suggested that we need to have some principles built in to guide decision makers. So into considering whether a particular artifact should be deleted. How rich is the artifact? How accessible is it? What were the privacy settings like? Are other living people's privacies compromised by having that artifact continue to exist and be accessible? Who should have access to it? Only the people who had access while the person lived, or everyone? These are all, I think, very much live questions that we're going to need to grapple with. There's one final question, too, that I think we really do need to grapple with. And this, I think, is actually going to become really, really serious because I think the technology is going to get to us before we've got the ethics sorted out. This is a quote from my collaborator, co-editor, friend, and occasional karaoke sparring partner, Adam Buben. Adam says, imagine this. While your mother is still flourishing and lucid, she makes arrangements to have her appearance, mannerisms, voice, memories, and thoughts on a wide array of topics collected and synthesized through advanced recording and motion capture techniques. With the addition of sophisticated voice recognition, you would be able, in a way that is similar to playing a video game, to access her moving, speaking image and engage it in conversation. One might eventually consider holographic projection of the image for a more embodied feel. So in other words, what if we could take the things that people leave behind and actually turn them into an ongoing interactive avatar of the dead? Now, if you're a fan of the TV show Black Mirror, you may have already seen a fictionalized version of this. There's an episode from 2014 called Be Right Back, in which a young man dies. His pregnant partner signs up for a service that scrapes his social media and text messages and other things and uses those to create a chatbot that she can interact with that sounds like him, that gives the sort of answers he would give. Then she upgrades her subscription, feeds in a whole bunch of audio and video sources, and suddenly she has an interactive avatar she can talk to on the phone that sounds like him. Then she goes the whole hog and gets a full-blown, indistinguishable physical replica of him that she can interact with. It doesn't end well. I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but so it's been envisaged in fiction, but it's also been attempted by various startups, most of which have been pretty bad. Virtual Eternity ended up closing, I think, because they couldn't get legal access to some of the technologies they used, but the proof of concept stuff they did was very unconvincing. Attorney Me, I think, I'm not sure what they've produced so far. There was a service called Tweets On, which scanned your tweets and said it would continue to send out tweets that sound like you, generated automatically by AI. It produced gibberish, unfortunately, but it did have a really good tagline, which was, when your heart stops beating, you'll keep tweeting. So anyway, that was all like that for a long time. But then in 2018, something else happened. In 2015, a Russian tech entrepreneur called Roman Mazurenko was hit and killed by a car in Moscow. And his best friend, Eugenia Kudya, scanned all of his text messages and put them into a chatbot. And that chatbot is now available as an app that you can download in the iTunes store. And you can download and interact with a dead man. The next step in this sort of stuff is to then link that to a neural network, so it will continue to learn. And so it will not only get better at sounding like Roman, but it'll also potentially have a personality that will start to change over time. So we need to ask what the status of these replicas is. Now, I want to suggest that one of the keys to understanding this is what philosophers call alterity, the otherness of the other. I won't read these long Derrida quotes to you, but these are really interesting. Jacques Derrida, you may well know, some of you may have read him. Alternatively, you may have heard him as a sort of a boogeyman of people who think that postmodernism is destroying the world. Derrida has a really interesting book called The Work of Mourning, which is basically a collection of all the eulogies he gave, all the eulogies and death notices and things that he wrote, because he had a lot of famous friends who died and he was asked to give eulogies. And in some of these, you can see him wrestling with what he calls the necessity and obscenity of speaking for the dead, that we have to speak for the dead, and yet at the same time, there's something kind of obscene about speaking on their behalf rather than letting them speak for themselves, which they cannot. And he talks about the otherness of the dead, that when we live, people are already very radically other to us and almost unknowable to us. And when they're dead, that's doubly the case. So there's this otherness to other people that you can see in faces, I think. Here are two interesting examples of absent consciousness. Lewis Payne on the left was one of the conspirators in the conspiracy to kill Abraham Lincoln. He was involved in the attempt to kill Secretary of State William Seward. That's him after he's been caught. He's on the brig of a Union warship, on the deck of a Union warship, being held as a prisoner, waiting to be executed. Roland Barthes, in his fantastic book Camera Lucida, looks at this painting of Payne and says, this image is haunted by the fact that he is going to die and has died. On the right there, you've got one of the portraits of Bronzino, the great, one of the great Italian Renaissance artists. What I love about these images is the sense of absent consciousness, the sense that there is a consciousness behind the eyes that you can't get to, alterity that you can't get to, the sense that there is consciousness going on, but that it's both visible to us through the face and yet permanently hidden. It's what Wittgenstein called das Licht in der Geschichte anderen, the light in the face of others. And that light, I think, is part of what comes through in digital media and the things that we leave behind. But there's also the problem, of course, that if we just let algorithms present the dead, that true alterity is gone. The ability to shock us, to surprise us is gone. And that's actually something that C.S. Lewis was wrestling with after his wife died, that his wife's alterity was there, and he was worried that he was covering her over with his own memories of her, with his own thoughts of her. And he said, I just need a minute with her, even a few seconds with her, and that would blow all of my own ideas of her away, and I would have what she was really there. But that's what's gone, he says. All reality is iconoclastic. The earthly beloved, even in this life, incessantly triumphs over your mere idea of her. And you want her to. You want her with all her resistances, all her faults, all her unexpectednesses. That is, in her foursquare and independent reality. But that's gone, he says. The rough, sharp, cleansing tang of her otherness is gone. Now, what I want to suggest here is that the worry in these online avatars of the dead is that we will come to forget that the alterity is gone. We will allow ourselves to forget that, or that the algorithms can't surprise us, because everything there is to represent the person is already in there. Or maybe the algorithms will get so good that, in fact, they give us a simulacrum of surprise, a simulacrum of alterity. They'll give us a false version of the surprising otherness of other people. And then when that happens, I think we will actually be replacing people in a way I think is ethically troubling. So one suggestion I want to make here, and this is the suggestion I'll end on, is that if we're going to have these technologies, and I don't think we can stop them completely, we should make them deliberately a little bit bad. Right? Build deliberate glitches in. Why? Because glitches remind you that it's just a recreation. Make it stop every so often. Make it do something that's bad, something that reminds you that what you're dealing with is merely an electronic simulacrum and not the real person itself. Heidegger called it unready to handness. You know, when you don't think about your hammer until the head falls off the hammer, and something that's like, oh, it reminds you that it's a tool. It reminds you that it's a physical thing. We need to have that unready to handness assert itself to stop us turning the dead into a mere resource for the living. I'll finish up there, but I'm really keen to hear some of your thoughts and questions. Thanks very much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick, for such an insightful presentation. I think we've all got a lot to think about now, and we've got plenty of time for questions, which is great as well. We had one come through from Kerry with a question sort of more about online presence while live, wondering how, if we can, remove instances of information about ourselves from the internet. Say if you typed your name into Google, can we request this to be removed?
Sure, that's a really interesting question. So that has been grappled with in European law in recent years. So you may have heard of this. There was a case that happened where there was a Spanish guy, his name escapes me just at the moment, I'm sorry, but he was a Spanish lawyer and real estate agent. And his problem was that when you Google his name, the first thing that came up was 10-year-old news stories about a bankruptcy that he'd had. And he said, this is a problem here, because he said, well, you know, this is ruining my reputation. People are Googling me, and the fact that I was bankrupt has come up. He said, it's not relevant. It was 10 years ago. I'm doing fine now. So he actually asked Google to delete the search results. Google said no. He ended up taking it to one of the European courts, and they ended up saying that, yes, people have what the court called a right to be forgotten. Now, the very phrase right to be forgotten is paradoxical. A right creates a duty. Right? If you have a right of free speech, that means I have a duty not to interfere in your speech, and so on. But to have a duty to forget someone seems paradoxical, because forgetting someone, strictly speaking, is not something you can choose to do. Right? We don't really. If we could just choose to forget things, you know, life would probably be an awful lot simpler. So there's an interesting kind of question there. I think part of the problem with it is that the internet collapses everything into the present. Right. So what you did 10 years ago and what you did 5 minutes ago are the same number of clicks away. And that was the problem that this chap was having in Spain. Everything gets crushed into this sort of eternal present where all moments of time are equidistant. They're all the same number of clicks away. I don't really think we're going to change that. I think there are some mechanisms being introduced for making the internet forget, so right to be forgotten and so on. But fundamentally, I think the longer term answer is not so much that we have to get better at making the internet forget, so much as that we have to make the internet more forgiving. That is, people need to be more prepared to forgive what people have done in the distant past. Look at the way, just as an aside here on this, look at the way that political campaigns always go, right? The last, 5 years, we've seen over and over and over and over and over again, an election campaign gets going and suddenly a whole bunch of candidates have to be disendorsed because someone's dug up something that they posted on social media 4, 5, 6 years ago. This is an ongoing problem that we're not going to get rid of. And so I think the response to it has to be to be more forgiving and not let forgetting do the work of forgiveness, which I think we're very often very accustomed to doing.
Cool. Thank you very much for that great response. So following on from some things you talked about when you were talking about some recommendations you made about how people might be able to nominate next of kin for their digital remains. So Tanya was asking about that, and a step further, is this something you see as people being able to incorporate in their wills?
Yeah, so this is actually something that is happening now. People are starting to do digital legacy planning. And some services, I think Google in particular, will allow you to set somebody as your sort of trusted person who has a kind of authority over these things. It's being pushed more and more that this should happen. There's a question as to how you make that happen voluntarily, though. I mean, only half of people make wills. A lot of people just don't ever get around to it. And even then, you've then got to sort of make sure that every little country solicitor and whoever else is prepared to sit down with somebody and say, oh, and by the way, we need to work out some digital legacy planning for you and work all that stuff in. So in some ways, it is a really good solution to the problem. It's a good thing to do, is to build that into your will. But at the same time, we probably do need some legislative backup as well, because not everyone's going to do it. And there are going to be problems that arise. And those problems can be really heartbreaking. There was a case in Germany recently where a teenager, unfortunately, died by suicide. And her family tried to get access to her emails and to her social media because they wanted to see what she'd been saying and try and get some insight into why she died. And the courts in the end had to grapple with this, and in the end they decided that there wasn't actually a reason to give the parents access. And that's a real question too, because in law, I'm told, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm told that in law, your privacy rights disappear on death. You don't actually have a right to privacy after you die. Ethically, there's a really interesting open question there about whether you do in fact have a right to privacy after you die, and what violations of that right might be permissible or impermissible.
Right. Another question from Rebecca. She says, you mentioned interacting on social media as a means for continuing to interact with the dead. In your experience, has this been considered instead as an indicator of the performative nature of our lives, that we are now performing grief for others?
Yeah.
Not to suggest, that Rebecca says that the grief behind the act is not genuine.
Yeah, no, that's again something that a lot of people have talked about. When you go onto somebody's social media profile, some of the empirical data that's been done on this suggests that people genuinely think they're talking to the dead, right? They genuinely think that they are interacting with a dead person, and that the dead person can hear them in some level. But they've also got to be conscious, and I think you're absolutely right about this, that even though they're addressing the dead and they're addressing them in second person, I wish you were here and so on, they've also got to be conscious that they're being read by living people, and that they are in fact part of a community of mourners that form in these spaces. I once described what happens on Facebook after somebody dies as an open-ended, ongoing electronic wake. And to a certain extent, that's what happened. You get like a sort of wake. But it's really interesting that people there don't so much address each other as they address the dead person. And certainly after a little while, at least, they stop addressing each other altogether and just address the dead person, which I find really, really fascinating. Actually, if I can just quickly say, because I just think this is a really fascinating little anecdote, not the internet, but I think 2010, there was a Japanese artist in a town in Japan whose cousin died, and he missed talking to his cousin on the phone. So he bought an old phone box, like an old red phone box with a disconnected old rotary dial telephone in it. It's not connected to anything. He set it up as a sort of an art installation, and there's a place he could go and he could just talk to his cousin. Of course, his cousin can't hear him and can't speak back. A couple of years later, or a year later actually, the town was devastated by the tsunami that occurred in Japan. I think 10% of the town 10% of the people in the town died, and a huge chunk of the town was destroyed. And what started happening? But the wind phone, as he called his installation, the wind telephone, is still there because it's high up on the hill, so it survived. And so people from the town started coming to the wind phone and talking to their dead loved ones from the tsunami on the phone. And then people from all over Japan came and started talking to their dead loved ones on the wind phone. Now, in that case, the communication is private; no one else can hear it. But to me, it's of a piece. It's this idea that we're so embodied to these forms of communication that we feel like it's the only way we can continue to communicate with the dead. Is it entirely performative in one sense? Yes, I'd say it's more a case of what Kendall Walton called, make-believe. And in make-believe, we use props. So the broomstick that the kid rides on is what makes it true in the make-believe world that the kid's riding a horse. The wind phone is what makes it true in a make-believe world that I'm talking to my dead loved ones.
Right. Thank you. Now, we had two comments/questions come through back to back from Lauren and Jack. Interestingly, very similar content. They both reference a quote saying that we die two deaths. The first when our physical body dies, and the second when we are last remembered by someone. And
Goethe.
both have a similar question. Right, sorry?
It's Goethe.
Goethe.
Yeah.
And the question or statement they've sort of said is, does social media provide an avenue for our memory to remain past in prosperity?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that quote up. I have a paper called Deletion is Second Death, which is built around that quote. The idea that, we do die twice, and the second death is, I argue, is when we're deleted. So the Goethe quote says we die the second death when the last person who loved us dies. What I want to suggest is that actually, in a way, the second death is when all online trace of us, or all trace of our presence is destroyed or deleted. So yes, I do think precisely that. I think there is a kind of ongoing existence and a kind of continuity that you do achieve through social media. But two things to be said there. One, we've always had that kind of continuity through memory and through some of the other physical artifacts we leave behind. So it's not an entirely new thing, but there is a new degree and form in which we can continue. And secondly, it's a radically, radically diminished form. So there's some comfort in it for other people, but not much comfort, and no comfort at all for us. Right. So my fear of death is not at all ameliorated by having a social media account. I don't think, oh, I'm going to die one day, but at least my Facebook will live on. I might think, oh, well, that's nice for everyone else, but it's not going to fix my egocentric fear of death. But for other people, the fact that we persist in this way, I think, is partly a comfort and also partly a way in which we can actually, help to fulfill our duty to remember the dead and to keep testifying that this person lived and they mattered and that who they were mattered.
And another comment from Lauren, she's a paralegal in wills and estates. She's given us this information. She says her research has found that Google won't allow access to accounts unless there has been a legacy contact nominated. Mm-hmm. So she thinks depending on the platform, they will automatically protect access to your profiles.
Yeah, I think that is the case. This is part of the problem, and Lauren will know this working in this space too, is that there's this real patchwork of different different policy responses from different companies. And at the moment, it's more or less up to individual companies what they do. Courts are, though, increasingly being asked to adjudicate some of these cases when real disputes come up. There is an attempt in the US at the moment actually to introduce some uniform legislation. There's uniform legislation that's been drafted, and there's been attempts to promulgate that to try and sort of work out who has access to this stuff. It's stuff that, as I say, I'm actually really, really pleased that New South Wales is trying to grapple with this. I'm very much hopeful that we can convince other jurisdictions as well to get on board and to start trying to think about this stuff. But at the same time, and I'm sure I'm not speaking out of turn by saying this, the mood in the room when I was up at the meeting in Sydney recently was kind of like, this is so big and complicated, we barely know where to begin. It's such a mess in so many respects that it's very hard to know exactly how to put together a coherent policy response to it.
Right. I'm going to sneak a question in here.
Sure.
While you were talking about the chatbots, and I know it seems like pretty murky sort of territory, but to what extent do you think we should be pursuing this area, particularly, for example, with thought leaders, and if they pass away, but situations that might arise in the future that we would want to know what they might have thought about it.
Yeah, it gets very murky very quickly, right? So, first of all, do we have a right to use their material in that way? Or would they want it used in that way? Related to this, actually, I was chatting with students yesterday, actually. I teach a unit called Love, Sex and Death here at Deakin, and we're into the death component now. I was chatting about this yesterday with some students, and they actually raised the Star Wars movie Rogue One, where they used the image of Peter Cushing, who was long dead, and of Carrie Fisher, who at the time was still alive. And they used CGI versions of them. But then with the next movie, they've ruled out ever using CGI footage of Carrie Fisher, even though she is now dead. And it's interesting. It's like, okay, is that because she died more recently, or you feel like ethically it'd be wrong to do that, given that she's recently dead, whereas Peter Cushing's been dead for the better part of 30 years? Is that making the difference there? Is distance doing some of the work? That's one question. Who gets to make the call? Who has the right of disposal? Who actually gets to say, yeah, I think it's okay to do this, or this person would want us to do this? And then what uses would you make of that, right? So if it's a complete free-for-all, then there are going to be uses that are going to be appalling, right? We've now entered a period where it's possible to produce what are called deep fakes, which are really convincing video footage that appears to be of a real person, produced by taking 2 bits of footage and just digitally adding somebody's face to it. Immediately, this was used for porn. Right? This is the internet. So it's the first thing it does is it turns everything into porn. And so that's a question there about in terms of, do the dead have a right not to be used in that way, or in similar ways that might offend what the dead person would want? But then you get to these other questions as well, is what happens when these avatars are connected to neural networks and they keep learning? What happens when the personality starts to change and develop across time in response to new information? Do we view that as an extension in the life of the person? That person died but then lived on electronically and their personality continued to change? And, Uncle Dave was, a bit of a jerk while he was alive, but he really mellowed in his old age after he moved onto a computer. Is that where we're going to end up? What happens when these bots start interacting with each other? A point that actually the team at Melbourne Uni who work on this, Michael Arnold, Martin Gibbs, Bjorn Nansen, Tamara Cohen, and others, that they've got a research team there on digital memorialization. And one of the questions they asked in their book is, why would we assume that these avatars are going to want to talk to us when they could just talk to other avatars? What's going to go on then? So there are huge problems, I think, associated with every step of that development. And we haven't even really begun to grapple with the ethics of that. And again, I think it's going to be one of those cases where the technology is going to be here before we're ethically ready for it.
I did want to mention before we go any further, we've covered some pretty heavy territory in this webinar. So just to note, if this has raised any issues for you, please do get in contact with Lifeline or Beyond Blue. So just wanted to note that at this point. We had another question that came in from Michael, who asks, what is your opinion of other people using a dead person's account to post status updates, i.e. Stan Lee?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sometimes that can be done in a really lovely way, actually. I think the intent does actually matter. When Mark Colvin, the Australian journalist, died a couple of years ago, the news that he died broke, I think, about 11 o'clock. And then around 1 o'clock, his Twitter account sent out a tweet saying, "It's all been bloody marvellous." Now, at the time, I was like, oh, hang on, how did he do that? I know how he did that, and it's not necessarily a secret because his widow told me in open Twitter, so to speak, but I'm not going to say because I don't want to spoil it. But things like that, I think, can be quite beautiful sometimes, but they can also be potentially problematic. Again, I think one of the important things here is to make sure that whoever has access to that account, for instance, if it's memorialized, whoever's going to have access to log in and change things, is somebody you want to do that. So that is a real issue. But there's also going to be interesting times where, again, wishes are going to clash between people. I spoke to somebody a couple of years ago who works in this space, and the reason she got into it was that her brother died under pretty horrible circumstances. And suddenly she said there was this real tension that she and her siblings wanted his Facebook profile to be left alone, because to them it gave a sense that he was still there. It gave a sense of presence, and there was something comforting in it. Whereas their parents were freaked out by it. They was creeped out this thing continued to be active, and they didn't want that. They didn't want it to be active in that way. And then there was a question of, his partner getting upset because, old girlfriends and stuff would post messages and things on there. So there are these questions around what I referred to earlier as grief enfranchisement as well that all come into play. So I don't think there's a hard and fast, no one else should post on somebody's account, or yes, it's perfectly fine, go for it. It's something that requires, I think, a great deal of judgment and wisdom and sensitivity, and there are going to be problem cases.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we've had, and I think that's a really nice point to end on. So thank you for your time, Associate Professor Patrick Stokes. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in. Sorry, did you have one more?
Oh, I was just going to say thank you very much again for the questions and everything. They're really great. And as I said, everyone's got experience of this, I find, or increasingly people do. So my contact details are there. If you've had some experience with it or anything that you wanted to raise about having had experience here, feel free to get in touch anytime, because as I say, I'm working on a book on this, and I'm always really keen to hear what people's lived experience of these issues is, because it's all new to all of us, basically, so we're all still just sort of mucking our way through.
Right. All right. Thank you again. I've just got a few more slides to get through. Please don't forget to follow us on social media. So Deakin Alumni has a Facebook and LinkedIn account, and we'd love to hear from you. Also a reminder that Deakin alumni and their direct families are eligible for 15% off postgraduate course fees. So find out more information about this great offer at the Deakin alumni website. You can submit any feedback about today's webinar to Deakin alumni at deakin.edu.au, and a recording of the presentation will be made available on the website within the next few weeks. So thanks again to Associate Professor Patrick Stokes, and thanks to you for tuning in. A reminder that if this webinar did raise any issues for you, please do get in touch with Lifeline or Beyond Blue, or go to their websites. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope you can join us again next time. Thanks very much.